right, so far in Aion, Carl Jung's compiled works, part 9.5. Uh, yeah, he talks through what he calls the individuation process, which is the process of finding wholeness. And through this individuation process, you have what he calls integrations of certain archetypes. So there are kind of these parts of yourself that you become aware of, that you consciously add its contents to your conscious mind and find wholeness. So we started this study talking about the shadow, which is the part of a person that they kind of push to the unconscious. It's pushed out of the conscious mind and the conscious personality. And then he talks about the antler animus, which is your psychology of the opposite sex. And then last time we talked about the self, which this is where Jung starts to get very mystical. The self, it's essentially like the union of opposites, chaos and order, masculine, feminine, the one and the many, the individual and the collective. It's basically all those opposite pairs that kind of the generative energy of everything. And that sounds very vague, but I guess he views the self as sort of this life force, this well, this water of life, or something. And he goes on next in the book to try to tie it into two traditions. He ties in his idea of the self to the Christian tradition through Christ being a symbol of the self, and then he ties it into the Gnostic tradition when he gets into alchemy.
Yeah.
How's that for a summary?
Yeah, that sounds about right. At least for the rest of it, because it would have been kind of hard to go through each chapter and trying to go through the detail of each one. When, as a matter of fact, I feel like the rest of it was better for you and I reading this, at least in our understanding of it. That we basically take it as a whole, if that makes sense. Just going through each thing here, trying to, I guess, distill it down into a way that's understandable for at least the both of us.
So, yeah, Jung likes to say, here's how the Christian tradition sculpted this idea of the self, and he actually gives the Christian tradition a little bit of criticisms here and there, and his view is that the Gnostic tradition is the response of the Christian tradition, like it was like the counterculture of it. So what he's trying to do is take what he believes to be good from two worldviews. So maybe we should start with the Christian tradition.
Mm-hmm. So I think we'll go back here. At least for chapter 5, I found it very interesting. Going back here, I found it interesting in terms of how he related God, in terms of his right hand is his mercy and goodness, and his left hand is justice and wrath. So you have two parts as a whole. And then I was relating that then to, at least in a more occultic sense, if we were to bring that down now to an imperfect level for humanity, the right-handed path is more of a path of goodness, wholeness, virtue, while the left-handed path is more of chaos, destruction, and vice. And I wrote down the 7 deadly sins and the 7 virtues, and then the 4 cardinal virtues. I'll start with that, which is, I think, from Aristotle and Plato. Prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. And then you have the main virtues of the right-hand path: humility, chastity, charity, gratitude, temperance, patience, and diligence. And then the left-handed path, which is the path of vice, pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, wrath, sloth. So the 7 deadly sins is the way how I can best understand that. But I do find it, if we're going to bring it up to a higher level now, back up to the level of deity, where you see, at least in the Gospels, where Christ says to those on his right, come into my kingdom, you who cared for the sick, you who did these things, you did these things for the least of me, while those on his left say, depart from me, you did not do these things, you did not care for the sick, you did not pursue goodness and righteousness, you did not do these things. I think that's quite interesting. I didn't really look into this, but why left-handedness is usually, and we don't really have to dwell on this for very long, but this is just something just to think about, why usually left-handedness is considered not to be the best, while the right-handedness is considered to be optimal. I think that's something to just think upon and digest. It's not really something we necessarily have to talk about more as we go on. And as well, in chapter 5, evil therefore is nothing but a privation of good, quoting St. Augustine. I would say evil is not necessarily the absence of what is good, but rather evil is the twisting of what is good. So evil is still a real thing, because if you were to say it is the absence of good, then what is evil? Because then evil would be a nothing, and if nothing is evil, then you can't say anything is evil, really, I guess.
Right, like doesn't have substance.
Yeah. So I say that evil is a twisting of what is good, and it becomes that thing that was once good. Because in the Christian understanding, the devil himself was once an angel of light. Since he fell, he became something that is evil, a very real thing. But he's a perversion of what was once good. So it's not the absence of a thing, is rather a twisting of a thing.
Yeah. Okay, let me try to... So many good thoughts there. Let me try to wrap this into Christ as a symbol of the self. So, Jung does start by being like, Christ is the perfected Adam. He has like the imago Dei, and he bears it properly. Like the vessel called the human being, up until this point, has not lived up until its potential and experienced fullness. And he's good. Jung is good with that. Like, yep, Christ, the new Adam, the imago Dei in its perfect form, good. And he also moves on like, well, Christ as the sacrifice of the ego for like the many.
Yeah.
He's good with that too. Like, he's fine with that. But where he starts to get into issues is Jung seems to think that the image of Christ is almost too squeaky clean in the Christian tradition.
Mm-hmm.
His thought is that the Christ, it's like almost like too perfect and unattainable. And that's when he starts to talk about the privato boni, that's my Latin, for the privation of the good, which is Augustine's view on evil. That evil is just the way the world works, with like kind of good taken away. So like if goodness was like a light, it's like not shining on something, and it kind of like festers and withers and wriggles in the dark. He starts talking about that, and he spends a lot of time weighing that idea, which he seems to think it's equivalent to the whole Christian tradition, which, listening to you right now, you're not on board with that.
No.
And
even though I like Augustine on that, but continue.
Yeah, he comes out on page 53. So Jung is he's Swiss. He's a German. He's in Europe, and he starts talking about some of the horrors of World War II. One can hardly call the things that have happened and still happen in the concentration camps of the dictator states an accidental lack of perfection. It would sound like mockery. Jung's counterpoint to the privado bene.
Yeah, my Latin is not my strong suit either.
Yeah, his counterpoint, like this World War II that's happened in Europe. Yeah, you can't say that that's just goodness not shining its light. Like there's something very malicious and intelligent and like pathological about it. And he likes to use that alongside with Christ. He believes that the Christian tradition shows Christ as like, here's like the completed form of the human, the imago Dei well lived up to, and everything else kind of falls short. That's his view of what Christianity thinks, and he says it's insufficient because it doesn't actually take in like malicious evil into account. So he's kind of on board with Christ to an extent, like the sacrificing of your ego for like loving your fellow man more, like absolutely that's part of the image of the self. The perfected human nature, absolutely. But when it gets to what he believes leaving out the problem of evil, that's where he departs from Christian tradition and starts to search Gnosticism.
Yeah, I would try to relate it if I were to make a comment on that to the human nature of Christ, because there's obviously the divine nature of him, where he's able to do miracles, forgive sins, and to be sinless. But in terms of the human nature, the scriptures do say that he was tempted in every way, but yet he did not give himself into sin. But my guess is he did at least struggle in life with hunger, thirst. He probably went to the bathroom. He did, I'm sure, get impatient with people, but he got impatient with people in a righteous sense. So for instance, if you see somebody messing up again and again, but they're almost not wanting to improve, you can be like, guy, what the heck are you doing? We've done this 30 times already. You haven't really done this thing. And they give 100 excuses for why they haven't done it. It's like, okay, you're not actually wanting to improve yourself. So I think and I get where at least the way you're explaining it, where Jung would be coming from, that for the human being to try to obtain that perfection, I would assume, is a very, very high goal. I don't want to call it unreachable, but at the same time, it's a very difficult goal for majority of the human race. And I think it's just, that's why, and I'm speaking in this from the Christian sense, this is why there's the work of the Holy Spirit, which can help you in your day-to-day life. So in the Christian sense, that's how I would relate it. In the Jungian sense, I'm sure you know a bit more about that than I would.
Yeah, this is... what you're saying is like straight gold. Like, yeah, and to concisen it up, it's exactly that. Jung thinks that the Christ image is perfection, where Jung thinks the goal of a person should be wholeness. So,
and I would agree with him on that one, that it should be wholeness.
Yeah, so that's his main issue with the Christian tradition, is that he thinks it's bringing people towards perfection and not wholeness. And it's very frustrating because later in the book he says the word perfection gets its sense from the Greek word. I'm not going to try to read the Greek word.
It's okay. Greek is Greek to me.
Telios. It's actually not bad. Okay. Wow. Jung actually likes to write in Greek letters, so I had to quickly.
Yeah, I'll say this. He's smarter than me.
And I was listening to Marty Solomon, who is one of a Messianic Jew, and he makes this argument that the Greeks give us this idea of perfection, like the Platonic ideal, things being perfect, whereas in the Hebrew tradition, they have the idea of goodness. So in Genesis, God created something and it was good. He created something else as good. He created man and he was good. I think he uses the double word good. So I think if you brought in more of the Jewish tradition in his understanding, he wouldn't get so hung up on perfectionism, which just turns into legalism, which is a lack of grace. He wouldn't get so caught up on Christ being too perfect and squeaky clean, because there's something to be understood about grace, and there's something to be understood about the Hebrew idea of goodness as opposed to the Greek perfection.
That's a good way of putting it. I'd have to look more into that for a better understanding of that, because it sounds more down to earth and human, if I could put it in that way. What was another thing I wanted to mention? I think I wrote a lot on chapter 5, as Christ is a symbol of the self. Obviously, me disagreeing with certain parts of Jung, but I think Jung has some good wisdom to bring, at least. Oh yeah, and here's one thing here. In relation to Christ, to take on willful suffering or to willfully follow virtue, Jung's idea of individuation for somebody will possibly be achieved. So it's Christ willfully taking on suffering on himself I assume this is more the Jungian term. Christ taking on suffering for the self is to have better wholeness, or to have complete wholeness, because you're not trying to deny what is to be done, because sometimes, and I'm sure this is for myself, what has to be done can be painful. And to relate it to Christ, what he did on Calvary was a very painful thing, because for Christianity, if you're taking on the entire sins of the world, that's a very painful emotional experience. And then you also have the whipping, the cross, carrying of the cross up to Golgotha, and then being hung on the cross for 9 hours after being torn to shreds with a whip. Yeah, I think that's taking on willful suffering to have a far better sense of individuation or wholeness. So I think this is a good lesson. Be able to be. It's not that you have to take on suffering for suffering's sake. It's not so much that, but rather take on what needs to be taken on. And if you have to suffer, then suffer well. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Is this up?
Checking on some technical stuff. I think yours is good.
Okay. Sorry, I was just looking for the audio, and yours is a little louder than mine. Okay.
I'll try to back away a little bit.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, the sufferings of Christ is something I'm not. I don't fully understand.
Oh, there's a song I should send you.
Okay.
But continue.
Like we do have things that we're asked to bear, and I don't know why certain people are asked to bear more suffering than others. And then being Christ being him who bore all suffering and being a living example and not caving to fear and like overcoming death.
Mm-hmm. I think he was fearful. But you say not caving to fear. So that makes sense. Yeah, it's not so much not being afraid, but rather moving past what you are scared of. Or even if you're scared in the moment, it's taking it step by step, regardless.
Could you give that summary you gave on Jung's view of alchemy?
Sure.
So this is getting into the second tradition that
Yeah.
Jung is trying to synchronize.
Yeah. So the alchemical interpretation of the fish in alchemy, or all that other stuff. Here's what I wrote down. I want to start with this. In regards to knowing all by seeking knowledge from within, so this is basically know thyself. You're seeking knowledge from within. Jung might be in agreement with this. One cannot truly know something unless if he has not first either seen nor experienced it. True knowledge begins outside oneself. In order to better know thyself, one must first experience the world outside of himself before he can look within himself. If Christ is the ideal God-man that we are to emulate, then first we must seek that which is an ideal outside of ourselves in order to turn inward and think upon who we are as a person. Though change does begin with the self must know what to change into in order to be a more complete person. So in regards to change, how I understood how Jung was using alchemy is that in order for an impure object, that's what I was trying to think of. In order for an impure object to become pure, it has to go through fire. It has to go through a process first before it can be purified. And so for the human soul, for us to be more cleansed, there are times in our lives where we have to go through a trial by fire for ourselves. Because think about times in your life where it has been a hard road, but then once you've been through the other side of it, think about how much you look back and realize, oh, I learned so much through that. I didn't realize I was able to get through that. I didn't realize I was capable to get through that, but I actually was. For me, to relate it, is basic training. It was just tough for me because I had never really experienced anything hard in my life. That was the first time I really experienced some sort of hardship. And going through that made me a stronger person. Now, of course, there are times in life where I'm sure a challenge or a struggle can break us. But the question is, do we remain in our brokenness, or do we pick ourselves up and continue to walk despite the brokenness that we feel? Because I think in order to have a more integrated person, it is good to continue to walk forward. There's a proverb in the Bible that says, the wicked man falls once, but the righteous man falls 7 times and gets up 8. So what does this mean? The wicked man just stays down, stays in his misery, but the righteous man continually gets up despite the challenge. So I understand if there's something in life that may have knocked you down, but if you continue to remain bitter, you're just going to stay bitter and you're not going to be a more as Jung would put it, as a more integrated person. Now, I get it. Tragedy can happen. You have some sort of possible mental illness or something, but it is good to fight through that. And sometimes we may not have the strength to fight through that. That is why it is good to get with somebody who might help you. Be it a good friend, family, therapy, even if you need to go to the gym, which I like to do.
Oh, shoot. I don't even know how to... I'll just take a stab at getting in on this conversation. So, I'll try to tie it back into alchemy. So alchemy, it's like the precursor of chemistry. Chemistry literally is like the study of change. You mix hydrogen and oxygen, you get water, all these things.
Witchcraft.
Yeah, so alchemy, precursor to chemistry, which it is about change, except alchemy, it had this view that the person mixing stuff, that there was a very soulish part in the process for them. With chemistry, if you mix the right chemicals in the right proportions, you'll get the same amount. But to the alchemist, when they're trying to create some new substance, they thought that there were things such as, did I close the door? Did I put salt around the room to make this potion? They thought there were certain rituals that the person did that actually affected the alchemy process, that the person making the chemical is just as important as the thing itself. And alchemy butted up against Christian tradition because it viewed the material a lot more, whereas the Christian world was more about the world to come, and the alchemy was more grounded in practice with physical things. There's some very interesting scientists who are alchemists that you wouldn't really believe, I think.
I think Isaac Newton was one.
Yeah, I think he dabbled in it.
And I think he was into magic, if I'm not mistaken. And I think he believed that dragons were real. Although I'd have to double check that. You can fact check me on that one.
Yeah, and like if you have these eloquent equations that can make you do trajectories and Newton's laws, but you don't know why matter changes form, why it can burn up paper or bake some ingredients and it changes chemically, then you can almost see why he felt that his worldview is insufficient. So that's alchemy. Alchemy, dead on. It's about transformation, and you also brought up the idea of refinement. I think I might be butchering the proverbs here. I think there's like a proverb about man being refined like silver. That you heat up silver, and then all the impurities go to the top, because the metal's probably going to be heavier than the other junk, because metals are pretty dense. And the silver be heated up, and you'd like skim off the top. So I think there is a proverb that kind of does what you're saying with, we go through trials so that we might be refined, fighting the good fight, and our souls becoming more pure. So, yeah, to Jung, alchemy is all about transformation and refinement, like you said. He wasn't really getting into the beliefs that you can make potions that do particular things. And that quote you read about things being understood through the external world before the internal world, he believes that some of the spiritual practices of alchemy may have been true internally, except they were projected onto the quest to create the Philosopher's Stone, or lapis lazuli, which I think they're kind of the same thing. It's a material that's essentially pure potential. It can transform lead to gold, or it can, like in our modern chemistry, we know these things are impossible, but part of their quest was trying to isolate the substance of transformation. It's a little weird, right?
I'm following you though.
It's like taking a flower and saying, this is like beauty. Let me extract the essence of beauty out of this flower, doing some concoction. And then now that I extracted beauty, I can like turn this into a love potion, make someone fall in love with me.
Okay.
Like it's trying to like extract essences in a way that nowadays we don't believe, but the alchemists wanted to get the Philosopher's Stone, which could transform any matter into anything else, which was in vain. That's kind of all I have about Gnosticism, and comparing it to the Christian tradition, he views, once again, his view of Christianity is that Christ was like too squeaky clean, and he was kind of the static, perfect thing. So his attraction to alchemy had to do with this idea of transformation, which I don't know how he left that out of the Christian tradition, but he seems to think that like a perfect static ideal versus these practices more towards transformation, he thought they were opposite to each other.
Yeah, I wouldn't say they're opposite to each other. I'd say we as changeable beings can walk ever forward towards what is, I guess, but like you said, static. But I don't like to use the word static because it means that it is not even something that is movable, though you could say God is unmovable. I think God is always in motion, but remaining the same, if that makes sense. What I mean by in motion, meaning he continuously moves throughout our lives. That's what I mean by it. It's continuously working us as human beings. And that we are the changeable, walking towards what is what will always never change. But that which is already unchangeable is already perfection. And to already strive for that, I think, and I'm trying to bring this down to a practical level. I think for us, if we get too hung up with the fact that we messed up here and there, we're going to drive ourselves insane, though it is still good to work on ourselves. Rather, work on just the small aspects of yourself that need improvement. Don't worry so much about the big stuff, because the small stuff eventually leads up to the big stuff. This is why you do small habits to create bigger habits. And I want to say this in regards to the Gnostic demiurge, and here's my note on it. Although the Gnostic understanding of the demiurge is wrong from traditional Orthodox Christian thought, to relate this to the human person, we can be the blind makers of our own life. Without having the ability to properly understand life in general, or even the tools to deal with it, the life we live will be lacking proper integration in our own lives. So if we're blind to the tools that we should use, we're going to be blind makers of our own world. But if we have the proper tools of understanding, we don't have to be blind watchmakers. We can have proper understanding of ourselves. It takes time. It is something that must be developed for ourselves. And my understanding of the Gnostic demiurge is obviously the Gnostics believe that Yahweh, or God of the Old Testament, is the demiurge who trapped us here in our material realm. They believe that the material realm is evil and that the spiritual is the more ideal. It's very Platonic in its thought, but that's a completely different topic. But I think that if we relate ourselves to a demiurge, despite the idea of the demiurge, I would say is wrong. We should see ourselves as always ever seeking. But there's that scripture that says, ever seeking but never finding. Let us seek and find what is true. Next question would be, well, what is true? Well, we can go with John chapter 14. I am the way, the truth, and the life.
I guess I only have two other thoughts. These are two more of Jung's thoughts, and I'm probably just going to present them in different ways than Jung did, just to make it a little easier. So, two ideas Jung. One was the hermaphrodite. The hermaphrodite, it's a male-female, I'll say combo.
It's the male and the female being in one body. Yeah.
Yeah, since Jung's view is that the self is the union of opposites, he views that as something very divine. It's almost as like the first being is like, and this is just like a pagan tradition, but the first being is one material, and then they split into Earth Mother and Sky God,
mm-hmm.
and then they have intercourse and then create all the creatures of the earth.
Mm-hmm.
Like everything is like sexually created out of this hermaphrodite that kind of like split in half and just made everything, which it's a very weird way of thinking, to be honest. And I'm going to compare it to Christian tradition in a second, but it's almost this idea that there's like this first combination, and then consciousness was almost split in half into male and female, that this hermaphrodite was kind of all things, and it intentionally divorced itself from its own state of awareness to produce all different creatures of all different types. So that's like a pagan view, basically. And then a Christian view in Genesis, it wasn't like things were just all sexually created. It was more of God created each creature and created them male and female.
Mm-hmm.
So it almost puts that divine attribute at the male and female level, rather than like God ripped in half and sexually created everything.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, you just birthed the deer, and then you just birthed the rabbit, and then you birthed this, and then everything was made. Like,
mm-hmm.
that's actually more put at the human level, which is quite different from the pagan traditions. I guess takeaways from that, Jung really likes to make God the union of masculine and feminine.
Mm-hmm.
And just his thoughts about masculine and feminine, the universals, having to like separate from each other, and like divorce being one hermaphrodite to be two things to then create all things. I don't even know how to describe it. I guess his view is that like having masculine and feminine separate and interacting raises like the consciousness of the cosmos or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. I get what you're saying. It's kind of hard to describe it. I don't really have much on that. I think a good way of putting it is, I think to contrast it with the Christian understanding, it's like God already a whole being creates man first, and then sees that man needs a helper, and then he creates Eve. So you already have something that is created, first man and then woman, something that's created separate from one another, rather than, say, having two things together and then they have to split. They're created separate from each other. Although woman is created from man, it's the thing that the man and the woman don't split in full knowledge of one another. Hopefully I'm not misunderstanding that, but rather you have a already whole creator creating two different things. I would say that man and woman are meant to be separated, are meant to be separate from each other, in the sense that they are their own persons, but they come together in a sense of wholeness towards each other for a greater union of love. Because I don't think love is meant to be complete and total self-love. I think greater love is shared love with one another. Obviously, humanity can be selfish, but that's why we need to learn to dampen our selfishness and have a greater sense of giving of one another. Willful giving, but obviously there's different ways of loving different people.
Yeah, I actually was Googling this too. There's the majority belief is that Adam was male, Eve was female. There's this really weird view by some rabbis that think that Adam was a hermaphrodite. It's like, I was looking it up, and it's just kind of all this woke scholarship trying to reinterpret the tradition. I was just kind of shaking my head at it, but like I can see why Jung thinks that the coming together of masculine and feminine and sexual union is an act of creation, because it is creating more life. But to generalize that act of creation as how God creates things, I don't know. I don't think it has to be a generalization that he makes. Like I can see why. I can see why anciently, like, I don't know, caveman brain, mythological brain, you could say like, sex is an act of creation, and like, how is that mountain made? Probably sex, but it makes more than just another man, so it must have been like a really great act of sex that the sky was there, and the trees are there, and the birds are there. I'm not in love with that interpretation. I can see why you'd want to link sexuality to creation, but
Yeah, I think it's a good way of saying that not everything needs to revolve around a sexual identity or even sex itself, because there is more to life than sex, but sex does help create human life for obvious reasons. But it is something that can be enjoyed within the confines of marriage between a man and a woman, and that is something I think that they should enjoy as often as possible. But with that being said, I think a good understanding of Genesis is wholeness. Two people who are separate can be together in a sense of wholeness. And now this is just me kind of going off on a little tangent. Wholeness can be sought even apart from somebody, but I think it's just loving the other person for who they are, despite their own inadequacies, even if it can be a little frustrating. But that's just my little tangent.
Yeah, and do you want me to just rush to the ending of this?
Yeah, go ahead. I don't really have much else.
So yeah, near the end of the book, Jung takes an attempt at redefining God, and he just keeps on wanting to add Satan into the Holy Trinity.
Oh yeah.
I don't know why.
Yeah.
He thinks that he believes that the Christian tradition has become too detached from the shadow and kind of our evil desires, and he keeps on adding Satan back into the Trinity, and I think it kind of boils down to this. Jung's view is that whoever God is the God of life and of decay, of health and of disease, of abundance and of famine.
Mm-hmm.
That God is this being that kind of makes and takes away and builds up and destroys. And with that, he has to put Satan back in the Trinity and make claims about God having a left and right hand, as you said earlier. The issue with this belief is you don't really get a good view of the afterlife.
Mm-hmm. It
kind of turns into a eternal reincarnations view, or almost just like a God that's just like running a simulation, is kind of amused by it. So I can see why he would make the final statement that that is God, and there's parts of nature that is very cruel, and he almost generalizes nature and makes God like the God of nature, of all things visible, like the whole ball of wax. Whereas the Christian view is that there's war on earth because there's war in heaven, that the invisible things got corrupted first, then the visible things got corrupted, with like a third of angels being taken away. And there was one other quote. When he's talking about Satan, he likes to relate him to the myth of the dragon, that the dragon hoards gold, and that it's kind of protecting a great treasure. And the hero myth is that the hero defeats the dragon without getting scorched by its fire and is able to take the gold.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't opposed to Christianity. I guess his view is that Jung's view is that Satan is also a teacher, and that there's a way of getting gold without being slayed by the dragon, and that's the hero's quest of not getting conquered by your dark side, but retrieving the gold that might be hidden in the parts of yourself that you repress. That's, I don't know, I don't think his thoughts on that have to be opposed to Christianity. Although he thinks slaying the dragon is like part of man's destiny, he wants to put the dragon or Satan in the Trinity and say it's a necessary part of the divine, which as Christians we just kind of got to throw that out.
Right, and for understandable reasons. Yeah, I don't really have much else to add to it. I think you had a good ending summary there. Do you have anything else?
I guess getting to the end of this book, I read Jung in high school,
Mm-hmm.
end of high school, right before college. And I got super into him. And finishing this book, I just got the impression that, I'm kind of good with Jung. Like, it's like saying goodbye to an old teacher.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he taught me some stuff, and it's almost like I'm hitting some of the brick walls in his philosophy. And I understand his hurt with Christianity, especially with maybe some of the legalism and perfectionism of certain groups being crushing and not actually leading to wholeness of people.
Yeah, and I agree with that too.
However, my bag of him is pretty mixed. I do like his idea of archetypes is, he's called the King of the Unconscious. I think that's one of his titles. And a friend at work the other day said he listened to the podcast and just brought up the word mindfulness. That's from a different tradition, but just the idea of being aware of all the stirrings inside yourself and all the things that echo through you after a long day of work, and all the desires that you can kind of be aware of having. Yeah, I really credit Jung with that, of just this almost balance through awareness, as opposed to his day, all the propaganda and loudness of the world.
Mm-hmm.
I respect him. He's very kind of wise and zen. However, I cannot really stomach his version of God.
I'd say his version of God is. That's a good way. I honestly, I don't have much thought on it. Yeah, I think the way you were explaining it is good.
So we have another book to announce.
Yeah, next one we'll be doing is Screw Tape Letters by C.S. Lewis.
Back on the Lewis train.
I really enjoy C.S. Lewis. I've gone through most of his books, not all of them yet, but most of them, and they're really good.
All right. Well, until then.
Yeah.